Hello, everybody. Thanks for having me. I'm going to share my screen and then we can get going. Okay. Can you see the full screen?
Yep, good to go.
Okay, great. Thanks, everybody. Good to be here. I'm Rob Mains. I'm a writer for Baseball Prospectus, and as Scott said, I'm going to talk about lessons we learned during an experiment last year in the National League with a designated hitter. This is a line that I can't remember what pundit said that I stole this from. But, one of the things that we learned, one of the many things we learned in 2020 were various things about science that, in all honesty, we probably could have lived our entire lives very well without having to know. But, the years behind us, and one of the things that we learned about was the idea of randomized controlled trials. Such as the ones that made our vaccines. As you know, in randomized controlled trials, you randomly assign individuals to various groups. There are very strict protocols over sample size, over what's being measured, over how it's measured, and what kind of outcomes are statistically significant. They've become the gold standard for medical development and in other fields as well, not just for drug development, but also devices and medical procedures. But they're not the only kind of valid experiments that can be done. They're also what are called natural experiments. In natural experiments, you have things going on in a population over which the experimenter typically doesn't have control. Examples of a population-wide natural experiment would be what happened in the Scandinavian countries, where you had Norway and Sweden pursue very different reactions and procedures in response to COVID-19, and how those impacted their respective national health and their national economies. You can also have natural experiments representing splits in a population. Anything that you read about the effects of poverty in terms of life expectancy or health outcomes or job outcomes, et cetera, are the result of a natural experiment. We don't randomly assign people to be poor or not, but rather we look after they've experienced their lives and how their lives have progressed to come to some conclusions about what happened. And what I'm going to posit here is that what we saw with the National League implementing the DH for that shortened 2020 season was a kind of a natural experiment. But before we get to that, we've got to go back about 50 years to January 1973 at the MLB meetings that year. The American League had a really wretched year at the plate. Teams scored less than 3.5 runs per game, only in 1968 and a couple dead ball years, and things been worse. And of particular concern for American League owners was that per team attendance had fallen for 5 straight seasons. 67, you'll recall, was a great pennant race. 7 of the 10 teams drew at least 950,000 fans. By 1972, there were 2 more teams, only 4 of them did. And remember, this was the 70s. You didn't have billion-dollar national TV contracts. You didn't have regional sports networks. You didn't have MLB advanced media. Fans in the ballparks were how teams made money. And so AL owners, concerned about financial viability and growth, thought that the way that they could get more fans to the game was to make the game, as Brian was saying, more exciting by scoring more runs. What they came up with was a new rule called the designated pinch hitter. Everyone knows about. This was not a natural experiment. Yes, it was something that was foisted on a population, but that population had several months to prepare for the change. So what we saw in the very first year, as teams prepared for this new rule, is they, by and large, had a strategy for getting an old guy to be their DH. Couple moves were done late in 1972 that may or may not have been prescient, but what we saw after the rule was made, several teams signed or traded for older players at first, poor glove guys, and teams who had old guys on their roster, several of them saw increased playing time from 1972 to 1973 because there was a DH that allowed them to get on the field more. Tony Oliva, of course, had a terrible knee injury in 72, never played in the field again. Bates Brown went from being a great pinch hitter for the Tigers to the long side of a pretty ancient DH tandem. His platoon partner was an even older Frank Howard in his last year. That was the first strategy. However, you could say that it didn't work out quite as well as the American League owners and managers had hoped. That's a kind of pedestrian slash line that they put up. And certainly it was a lot better what the pitchers did the year before. But if you rank all the players in a lineup by OPS, DHs were worse than everybody except the 3 glove first infield. That didn't work, and over the years, the strategy has evolved. No longer are we just seeing old guys as DHs. There are 9 players who have played 1,000 games as DH. David Ortiz, Harold Baines, Edgar Martinez, Hal McRae, Frank Thomas, Don Baylor, Paul Molitor, Chili Davis, the one that everybody forgets, and Travis Hafner. None of those guys were old when they started being a primary DH. What happened instead is they had defensive limitations, or particularly in the case of Martinez and Molitor, they had difficulty staying on the field when they played defense. So what has happened over the years is that teams have evolved their strategy to match their personnel. The Red Sox, if you got David Ortiz for 14 years, you're going to use David Ortiz as your primary DH whenever you can. The 1 year of these 14 years that they didn't, he was hurt. On the other hand, the Yankees didn't really have any primary DH the way that the Red Sox did with Ortiz. They didn't use a single guy as their primary DH more than a couple times. However, they were able to get something done with the roster that they had. More importantly, is what we've seen over the years is that offensive performance has improved. This chart shows is the rank of DH's OPS among the 9 positions. You'll recall in 1973, they were in 6th place, and what you can see is that generally they've done pretty well. That red dotted line that's being drawn tells you that on average, DHs have ranked about 3rd in offensive performance among the 9 positions. Pretty good. The outlier year there, 2017, you had a terrible Albert Pujols season, terrible Mark Trumbo season, terrible Carlos Beltran season, when his offensive contributions to the Astros were a little bit more off the field than on. So what has happened over the years is that the American League has settled on a knowledge that the best performance is if you've got a full-time DH. That doesn't mean that if you've got a full-time DH, you're going to have the best performance. The teams that have full-time DH tend to do the best. This table shows the team that has led the American League DH OPS over the last 10 years. What you can see is that only 2 of those seasons, the teams not have a more or less full-time guy at the position. Got somebody good who can play DH full-time, that's the way to have success. So this brings us to 2020. And I would argue that this was a natural experiment for the National League because none of the adjustments that they would have done like the American League teams did in 1973 or that American League teams have evolved their strategy towards in the years since were available to them. We only knew there was going to be a DH a month before a delayed start to the season. Too late to add anybody, and even if you could add anybody, we didn't know if the DH in 2020 would persist into 2021. So you're not going to acquire somebody for more than a year who can't play the field because that guy would be worthless in what appears to be the 2021 National League. So consequently, with only the rosters the team were given, they had to develop DH strategies given the hand that they were dealt. We've never seen this before where teams have had to adjust to a major strategy team, at least not in my memory, basically on the fly. I thought this provides an interesting experiment, 2 areas in looking at the DH. First one is what's known as the DH penalty. This was identified by Tango, Lickman, and Dolphin in their seminal book, The Book, back in 2007, where they found that batters do worse when they're pinch hitting or DHing than when they're in the field. Great example, Nelson Cruz, certainly the best DH over the last several years. In his last 562 game season, good as he was as a DH, he hit better when he was in the field. Not just because of unfamiliarity, this has persisted for a long time in the American League. Of the 79 AL batters over the last 5 full seasons who had at least 100 plate appearances, both as a DH and as a non-DH, their OPS when they were playing in the field was 46. So, get the DH basically sprung on the National League in 2020. What happens to the DH penalty? Is it greater because of lack of familiarity? Is it the same? Is it less because for whatever reason, it's a new thing that they can react to better? The problem with doing this comparison is that there aren't a lot of players in the American League that fall into the sample because the American League uses a lot of full-time DHs. The leading DH in the National League was Marcell Ozuna. He had 88 plate appearances, not as a DH. The top 7 DHs in the American League combined had fewer than that. So they're not included in any kind of reasonable analysis of the DH penalty. And of course, we had short season and small samples that worked there as well. What happened last year? Well, if we look at the players who last year had at least 40 plate appearances as a DH and 40 plate appearances in the field. In the AL, because there were so many full-time DHs, there was only 13 players. What you can see is that on average, their DH penalty was about 60 points of OPS, how much worse they were when they were DHs versus when they played in the National League, much bigger sample, and the mean penalty was really about the same. So that might make you think, same penalty, NL was on equal footing with the AL. However, if you raise the standard just a little bit, you won't have very many players in the American League, but those players had about the same DH penalty on a mean basis. Median, it almost went away. Now, yes, only 5 players. It does suggest something different than what we saw in the National League, where there were 11 such players who experienced a much larger DH penalty than they did either in the smaller sample or compared to their American League peers. A couple examples. The Pirates used 2 DHs who weren't that bad in the field. They were wretched as DHs. Jesse Winker was actually one of the best DHs in the National League. However, he still was better when he played in the field. Exception was Ozuna, who was excellent in the field and absolutely devastating when he was in. So what can we conclude here? I think we can conclude that the DH penalty, when the DH implementation was basically a natural experiment for the National League, was at least as great and very possibly greater in the National League than the American League. I wish we had a larger sample size so we could get some idea of what was underlying that, but I think we can definitely say the DH penalty didn't go away and in fact may have been even worse. The other area that I think is really interesting here is how the NL teams implemented the strategy of DH. As I said, the full-time DH was not available to the National League because of what the rosters were. There were 6 guys in the American League who started at least 40 games of DH. There was nobody in the National League who did. And if you look even at National League players who started a third of their games at DH, or a third of their team games at DH, only a handful of them were DHs more than they were players who played in the field. So consequently, National League teams had to vary from the successful full-time DH strategy that had been implemented in the American League. So the question is, what strategies did they employ? Were they successful? And if so, is there something that we can learn or over the course of the 1-year experiment in the National League that might be applicable to the American League? I identified 4 different strategies that teams use. One is to have kind of a full-time DH. Atlanta, Cincinnati, and St. Louis had one guy who started over half their games at DH. The Rockies, Matt Kemp wasn't quite there, but he appeared in 4 other games, so it's in the majority of their games at DH. That was one tranche of teams. Second is there's some teams that did what I call a job share, had 2 primary DHs. We already talked about the Pirates and how unsuccessful they were. The Marlins use Jesus Aguilar and Garrett Cooper. The Giants, Wilmer Flores and Christian Slater. And the Cubs used whoever wasn't catching that primary DH. There are a few teams that couldn't decide. They wanted to have 1 or 2 key DHs, but they kept switching the role around. Brewers started the year with Keston Hiura and Ryan Braun is their DHs. Then they went with Daniel Vogelbach after a trade deadline deal. Mets started the season with Yannis Cespedes. He opted out. Then they got Robinson Cano. And then in the final month, they used J.D. Davis and Pete Alonso in a job share. The Phillies kept swapping it between Andrew McCutchen, Phil Gosselin, and when he was healthy, Jay Bruce. They also used Bryce Harper for 10 games. And the Nationals had kind of a full-time DH. Howie Kendrick started half of the first 38 games there at DH. However, he left the team, or left the season with a hamstring pull, and they used Eric Thames and Asdrubal Cabrera for the rest of the year. And then the final strategy, what I call pass it around. There were three teams all in the NL West that didn't employ anyone as even a leading candidate for DH. There was only one player on each of these teams who got as many as 10 games starting at DH. Nobody had as many as 15. And each of these three teams had 10 different players. And this is over just a 60-game season. They had 10 different players. Most of the position players on their roster started at least 2 games at DH. They just passed it around among pretty much all the position players. Frame of reference for that, in 2017, the Angels had only 3 players who started at least 2 games at DH, and they played 162 games. So that was a unique strategy that those 3 teams employed. How did it work out, and what might we learn from it? Well, the kind of full-time teams did all right. 788 OPS in last year's National League was pretty good. Atlanta, this is what the numbers next to the team symbols are. Atlanta was first in DH OPS in the league. St. Louis was 6th. Cincinnati was 8th, but that was still above average. The ones that did a job share, it kind of fell on their faces. Miami was okay, but as you can see, Chicago, San Francisco, and Pittsburgh were the 3 worst teams in the National League in DH performance. Teams that couldn't decide were a mixed bag. The Phillies and the Mets were pretty good. Brewers and Nationals were, below average. And then the ones that passed it around were interesting. Those numbers aren't that impressive, but they're dragged down by the Diamondbacks, who had the lowest ISO among their DHs of any team in the majors. If you throw them out, you'll see the Dodgers and the Padres were actually pretty successful, having nobody even resembling a full-time DH. So what can we conclude from this strategy that the National League employed? Well, I think that the American League's lesson of a full-time DH being the best still applies here. The teams that came closest to that did the best. Now, granted, that's kind of tautological. If you've got David Ortiz or Nelson Cruz on your roster, of course you're going to write their name on the lineup card whenever you can. But NL teams that didn't have the opportunity to have those guys were robbed of that opportunity, and they will continue to be unless there's a universal DH adopted in the league. I would suggest that the multi-year contract that Ozuna signed with the Braves suggests that we are going to get a full-time DH. If not this year, probably next year. Sorry, DH haters, but the writing's on the wall. The other strategies that were employed, the attempt to cobble together a DH were mixed. Granted, the Mets and the Phillies had some success. However, when you consider that 2 of the DHs the Mets used, 2 of the DHs the Phillies used, Bruce and Gosselin, aren't even on those rosters anymore, I think you could view their success as kind of ephemeral luck rather than the residue of any kind of good plan. I don't think that this is going to be, or this is proven to be a way that anyone can build a sustainable success at DH, particularly when it's paired with the abject failure we saw in 3 cities. Now, interesting one is what happened in LA and San Diego, where you basically use the DH to let your bench guys get some at bats and to give your 8 position players, primary guys on the field, some time off during the season where they wouldn't have to play in the field and can just swing. That worked pretty well for them. In terms of that being a strategy that everybody can use, the problem is you're talking about a couple teams that have arguably the deepest benches or the deepest position player rosters in the majors. Yeah, this works great if your bench has guys like Chris Taylor and Edwin Rios and Jurickson Profar, and this year probably Cronenworth. Go for it. However, it's not exactly a sustainable or replicable strategy when most teams don't have that depth of talent. It can work, but only if you've got a tremendously deep roster. So what can we conclude from the National League's natural experiment with the DH? I'd say two things. The first one is that the DH penalty absolutely exists. It's not just an American League thing. The National League experienced and may have experienced it worse. One of the research projects I'm going to work on is to see whether players who've never been a DH experience it more than ones who have been, because there was definitely a penalty this year. If we look, though, at the DH performance in the National League overall, what we got was basically league average performance, a little bit better. Recall that in the first year that the American League had a DH, their DHs were 6th overall in batting. Same thing with the National League this year, only better than 3 positions, and their power numbers. Here's the kick in the pants to the American League, though. The National League DHs were actually better. American League DHs were last year. AL DHs had a rotten year. They were only 7th in the league overall, and sort of ignominiously, the National League DHs, the league that had never used a DH for more than 10 games in a season, they had more RBI than did American League. Now, you could look at that and say, the National League did better. Maybe there's something that the American League could learn from their success. As I've explained, I really don't think there is anything that we saw the National League do that is particularly replicable for the American League, nor is the National League's performance anything to write home about. Like I said, National League DHs were only league average. That isn't anything to aspire to from guys who don't even play the field or just going to be focused on hitting. Rather, I would say that what you take away from these numbers is not that the National League did well, but rather that the American League numbers were dragged down by abysmal seasons. Guys like Edwin Encarnacion, Jorge Soler, Shohei Ohtani, JD Martinez, those 4 guys combined for a 197 batting average. That wouldn't have occurred, I think, over 162 game season. Had they persisted with those numbers, it wouldn't have stayed at DHs. So I would view the fact that the National League did better last year at DH as a blip on the part of the American League, rather than anything that we learned that the National League could do that we can learn from. The roster, like the Padres and the Dodgers, then you can have everybody on your roster play at DH. I don't think there's very many teams in the American League that can do that. I think the successful strategy of having a full-time DH will continue to be the best. If I can take questions, I just want to make a couple acknowledgments. First of all, one of our sponsors for the conference, Baseball Reference, and their product StatHead Baseball was absolutely invaluable to me in getting the split data. Baseball References and StatHead are outstanding resources for anyone doing research. As is the place where I work, Baseball Prospectus, I got my full year numbers from BP. I'd like to thank SABR for putting on the conference and giving us a chance to get together virtually. And though I've been talking about a natural experiment, I would also like to tip my hat to the randomized controlled trials that made the vaccines that I hope will allow us to do this live next year. So that is my presentation. I'm going to stop sharing my screen and I'm going to check out what we've got in the question. One question from Peter Grobel: do I think the National League will eventually adopt the DH full time because it will lead to more runs, which will ultimately put more fans in the seats? Yeah, but I think that they're going to adopt it for other reasons, largely because pitchers really can't hit at all anymore. And you don't want to run the risk of any of them hurting themselves, running the bases or swinging. It sounds pathetic that these guys can't even do that. That's what's going on. I think the reason that we don't have a universal DH this year has everything to do with management labor negotiations and money, rather than any effort on the part of the National League to preserve the pitcher's batting. Question: is there a time series to discover a learning curve for DHs to overcome the penalty? That's a good question. I will, in looking at these data, I think this is something I'm going to try to pursue some future research. Another question: if MLB teams know that having full-time DH is the best for production, Why do we not see more teams drafting players who may be limited defensively, specifically for the DH role? Why are all young players tried in an assortment of positions before finding their fit? Well, I'd argue if you've got a guy who can hit like Trey Turner and also play shortstop like Trey Turner, you'd rather have him play shortstop. It's great to have a DH like Ortiz or Nelson Cruz. Let's face it, all the valuation metrics look at not just what players do, but also what they can contribute on the field. Why you don't see DHs leading the league in WAR is that they contribute nothing defensively. Certainly, if you've got a guy who can be a good DH, that's somebody who can be useful. I don't think they can be as valuable as players who can also field. You'd always prefer that. I think Yordan Alvarez, who may not ever play the field again, given his knees, really going to be a black swan, not something that we would normally. Question, does this imply that the pure DHs we have watched would have a projected higher OPS if they played in the field as well? I think yes, with the caveat that assumes they don't get hurt out there. Yeah, the DH penalty would suggest that. How will these insights potentially affect the league's thinking with respect to DH rule changes over the next 5 to 10 years? Look, everyone's known about the DH penalty for a long time, so I don't think that would change anything. I think the rule change we're going to get is that everyone's going to have a DH. Beyond that, I think that the efforts to get more offense, more scoring, more base running, balls in play will be more universal rather than looking at question, does your analysis consider the benefits of putting some of these NL players that are poor metric defenders into offense-only roles? Brad Miller, yeah, prime example, great offensive player, costs his team's run from being a bad defensive player. Why we need the universal DH in the National League. Guys like him who really don't contribute much with the glove don't have much of a role other than a pinch hitting role in the National League. And with 13-man pitching staffs, you really can't have a full-time DH. So DH is going to be a way to extend the careers of some guys who can't play the field, which is one of the reasons why there's money involved with it. Understanding that numbers from the 2020 season suffer from a small sample size tax, was there evidence to suggest the NLDH made offense better in a way the ALDHs have done for the junior circuit? Well, certainly, I mean, if you look at the slash numbers for National League pitchers in 2019, I don't have them handy. They were nowhere near as good as those abysmal numbers I showed you for American League pitchers in 1972. So to that degree, absolutely. I mean, scoring was up in the National League. It just wasn't up as much as I think people might have hoped for. Do I think that players select fielding abilities will be signed for less money with no DH in the NL, or do I think teams will sign them for a decent amount of money regardless of their fielding ability? Look, the best fielders, if they can hit, are going to make more than guys who can't hit, given equal offensive abilities. I would say that right now, if you're a bat-only guy, your earnings are limited because there's really only 15 teams that can pay for your services. That will consider that will continue until we have universal DH. Brian asks, what if DHs took grounders on the side to mimic playing the field and perhaps get results closer to the non-DH at bats? That's an interesting idea. I think that, look, I'm not a sports psychologist, but I think that one of the reasons why people think that the DH penalty exists is not only because, you know, you're sitting down, except when you walk up to the plate, a lot of guys will warm up in the dugout, but also because you're just not in the game as much. Whether that affects it, I don't know, but I don't think just taking grounders in the runway to the dugout would mimic being on the game, in the game. Is the passing around strategy, do we see players who DH as a day off from playing in the field get better in the days ahead? The rest they get from DHing help them in the future? Michael, that is a good question to which I don't know the answer. I think the idea of using the DH, and some American League teams do this, Rays do quite a bit. Using it as a place to, kind of a gym where guys can go to stretch out a little bit on days that they don't have to run all over the field is a good idea. I haven't looked into how successful that is. Can I explain the split since the beginning of the DH where the two league numbers are basically the same? I'm not sure I understand that question, sorry. If you're talking about the DH penalty being the same, I wouldn't attribute a lot to there except just a very small sample. Any idea as to why there's a DH penalty? Is there a possible confounder like DH is assigned after days of exhausting field play? The most recent research I've suggested is that somewhat similar to the PH penalty, which is more severe, is that the DH every time is kind of coming into the game cold. That's at least posited. I honestly don't know that. Like I said, I have a wife who's got a master's in psychology. I do not. Is the NLAL commonality a function of simple old hitters can still hit maximum, or is there an inefficiency to exploit here? Now, the commonality in DH performance between the two leagues, I would say is small sample weirdness going on in the American League that we would see under normal circumstances. The American League, given the way that their rosters are constituted, perform the National League. Do I think the American League will eventually get rid of the DH rule? Did I find any data regarding what spot in the lineup the DH is in is the most productive? I thought about that. And I'll be honest with you, that I think would have been an interesting analysis maybe 15, 20 years ago. But we've gotten to the point in lineup construction, I'm just thinking this today, where, we've got shortstops who bat cleanup. We got Joey Votto, who really can't run, leading off. I think managers and teams are smart enough to assign batting order positions by skills of the batter rather than kind of the image that they portray of whether they're a slow slugger or a speedy middle infielder. JD Martinez laments DHs don't get enough support during award voting. Will the DH ever win MVP? Well, as we move the awards voting more towards what we all know as sabermetrics, I think that's going to remain a pretty high hurdle, simply because if you're going to look at a guy's WAR or WARP, you don't get the same value if all you're doing is hitting and running the bases as you do when you play the bases. You'd have to have an overwhelmingly good DH performance, I think, to get MVP consideration when you consider that they're not adding anything at all with their gloves. And then I'll take one more. What are my thoughts on Giancarlo Stanton saying he thinks he would get less injuries by playing outfield more rather than being a full-time DH? I think Giancarlo Stanton is capable of getting injured regardless of what. I know what he's saying, that you're more in the game, you're looser when you're running around, you're not sitting between at-bats. I would look at Edgar Martinez and Paul Molitor counters to that. Okay, with that, I think I will say thank you to SABR and all of you for the great questions. Sorry I couldn't get to all of them, and look forward to joining you for the rest of the conference.